Hey everyone, welcome back to Sophomore Citizens. I'm Gigi.
I'm Liesel.
And I'm Lily.
Okay, so for today's episode, it is finally the highly anticipated episode about the book Luster by Raven Leilani. This is going to be a book club episode, and we will be discussing all things about Luster, a novel. And we will be going into all of the themes. We will be giving our rating and our review, our thoughts, and we will also be talking about some discussion questions, themes about the book. So this will be a conversation that will be fun to listen to, whether or not you have read the book, because we will be really jumping, using the book as a jumping off point to discuss greater themes, topics, things about life. And I think that we should just skip the check-in and jump right into it. So I can start out by reading a brief little summary for anyone who didn't read the book, and you girls could maybe add a little bit of flavor at the end if you want. I just pulled this from a random website, so take it as you will. Edie is stumbling her way through her 20s, sharing a subpar apartment in Bushwick, clocking in and out of her admin job, making a series of inappropriate sexual choices. She is also haltingly, fitfully giving heat and air to the art that simmers inside her. And then she meets Eric, a digital archivist with a family in New Jersey, including an autopsist wife who has agreed to an open marriage with rules. As if navigating the constantly shifting landscapes of contemporary sexual manners and racial politics weren't hard enough, Edie finds herself unemployed and invited into Eric's home, though not by Eric. She becomes a hesitant ally to his wife and a de facto role model to his adopted daughter, Akila. Edie may be the only Black woman young Akila knows. So that's where the summary leaves off. I think that that's a pretty accurate summary of what kind of happens. Do you girls have anything to add?
One thing that I found interesting while reading this book is I feel like I was waiting to understand like what the meat of the story was. And I honestly feel like she had such a lukewarm relationship with all three of the other characters and a lukewarm relationship with her own life. And so I just feel like that definitely like bleeds into the whole book being like a very low simmer.
That's a great way to put it. I also think that the summary touches on their open marriage and the sexuality stuff throughout the book, which is kind of what everything is about, but also somehow not at all. Like, I think when I started the book, I was like, okay, we're about the open marriage. That is what we're focusing on. But as I read more, I was like, maybe we're not about that. And just like that summary, it touches on it and it explains, but like somehow it's everything and nothing.
And like this is a very well written book, but I, having just finished the book, have the same exact takeaway from the book in its entirety that I do from the summary that you've just read. The teaser, what would usually be the teaser for like some, unraveling story behind it, it matches up perfectly.
Yeah. And I think like, a trapping of a book that is so kind of flowery and elaborate in its language is that oftentimes it does lack plot, and it's depending so much on this, beautiful syntax, but it's not really necessarily fueling the story so much. Like it's really just kind of a case study about a person. And I feel like it's kind of similar to poetry in a way. I'm not a big fan of reading poetry, and I know that a lot of people connect with it on a very deep level, but it's like because poetry is just all about the words and not about things happening, I find myself getting a little bit lost with it and not really necessarily relating to it. And so I feel like there were some sentences where I would read the sentence, I would be like, that was a beautiful sentence. And I will bring up a lot of quotes that I think are really good quotes and like really impactful statements. But then I would read another sentence and I would be like, she just spent like so much time and so many words to describe a whole lot of nothing.
I also will say I felt like all of our characters were like a shadow of a person.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't feel like anyone, like I don't think anyone smiled the whole time.
No,
I don't think anyone laughed the entire time.
definitely
And
not.
the lack of dialogue really adds to them being shadow people, in my opinion, because I just couldn't get a sense for literally anyone's personality. They were all so bland, you know? And even then, like, just to bring up a detail, when I learned that Rebecca, the wife, when I'm being given lack of detail about, I'm like, oh, she's just like our typical housewife, lives in New Jersey. And then I learned she likes to go to like death metal concerts and rip her shirt off. I'm like, literally, where is this coming from? And also the fact that like I just got such a sense of like nonchalance from every agent here of like, oh
Mhm.
yeah, like they're here now and sometimes we have sex, sometimes we have sex. Akila, the 13-year-old, is like, Comic-Con.
Yeah.
Like that's literally how they are.
I agree with that completely. And I think it led me for what I thought until having this discussion. I thought that maybe I was misunderstanding parts of the book because it would go 0 to 100 of like, we're in the house and now we're at a death metal concert ripping our shirt off. And like I remember thinking like, oh, I must have missed when like we were learning about that about her. But then it would happen and I'd be like, oh, what? I'm like, oh, maybe I'm just like a little slow or like I'm getting tired, like I should put the book down. And then the next time I would read, I would have a similar experience, but it was never like shock or plot twist in the way of like, oh, I'm intrigued. It was always like, oh, like I guess I'm just missing something.
Lily, I also kind of left space for that while I was reading of like maybe stuff is going over my head or like maybe I'm not like fully absorbing and appreciating all that this book has to offer, which is probably true. Especially because as I have sort of jokingly said about this book, I think it's a little above my reading level. And like not that I couldn't understand the book, like obviously I could, but there were definitely times where I was like there are more than 5 words on this page that I don't know. And so that means it's outside of my reading level.
Yes. Okay. So I, feel like that was a really good jumping off point. We gave some of our initial thoughts. Let's hold off on, our overall rating and review. So you have to keep listening to get to the end there. And I think we can dive into some of the discussion questions, themes, quotes that I kind of came up with that we can talk about. So I think obviously, as we mentioned, the first thing I want to talk about is their age gap relationship. And we can also touch on their interracial relationship a little bit. And all of what that brings to the book. I really, as we were saying, thought that would be the center of the book, like that would be the main component. And I think that that's really such a side plot and almost just like a device for other things to happen and for Edie to like end up in this weird situation. But it's like Eric, especially as a character, like I don't know him. Like I literally don't know who that person is at all, like what he's like, nothing about him. So one of the first things that I thought was kind of a good quote or an interesting thing that happened was this quote. She said, "It's not hard to be aware of an age discrepancy when you are surrounded by the most rococo trappings of childhood when they go on their first date at Six Flags," which I actually thought was quite a good quote. And like, that's one of the things that I can't personally imagine being in an age gap relationship. Whenever I would be like surrounded by like childhood or like references, I feel like that's when it would be most obvious to me and like most uncomfy to like be in an age gap relationship, you know?
Yes, and I think that especially with them, they just felt like people in such different places in their lives, which I think I may have even said this on the podcast. Like, to me, it's not the age gap that in my head is problematic or makes things work or doesn't, but it's whether or not like you're in the same on the same path, let's say, and like he has a wife and a family and he is a working man and she is that is not on her radar whatsoever. So like I don't really care if you are 15 years apart or you're 2 years apart, but like if you're in that same mindset, then I feel like it's a little less awkward when the kid things happen because either you're both in them or you're both not. But with this situation, I just felt like he was in his adult world and she was in the in between, and that's why they couldn't work. not because of the age gap inherently.
I feel like their relationship worked. And what I mean by that is that the purpose was so that he could feel young and so that she could feel old. And so, in that sense, it worked. Like, it achieved its goal, in my opinion. Like, no, it didn't seem fun or healthy or interesting, but like, it seemed to serve the purpose that they were kind of both going into this looking for. And
Yeah.
obviously, I'm reducing it down to he wants to be younger and she wants to be older, but like, you know, at its core, that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
yeah.
I think that perfectly goes into the other quote that I thought was like the most important quote about their age gap relationship. She said, and this is towards the very end of the book, after being a woman for 23 years, after the ovarian torsion and student loans and newfangled Nazis and button downs, I too am still alive. And actually, this is the more remarkable feat. Instead, I let myself be awed by his middling command of the wine list. So like at the beginning of the book, they go on a date and she's like impressed by the fact that he knows something about wine, which I feel like is a very accurate representation of what like a white middle-aged man has command of. But like it's so true that Edie has been through so much more in her shorter life. Like she's literally had an abortion and like dealt with racism and just dealt with so much more stuff and had so much more of like a complex, nuanced experience and understanding of the world. And I think that like that was probably Edie's most important realization from their relationship was like, okay, actually, like even though this like older white man who I've been taught is like smart and powerful and whatever in this world, like he's not actually that way. And I actually can be powerful in my own way. You know what I mean?
Yes, I agree completely, Liesel. And actually, what stood out to me more um, was the chunk like right before the quote that you just read. Um, or it's right around, but this is just what stuck out to me more is she says, he is the most obvious thing that has ever happened to me. And all around the city, it is happening to other silly, half formed women, excited by men who've simply met the prerequisite of living a little more life. A terribly unspecial thing that is just what happens when you keep on getting up and brushing your teeth and going to work and ignoring the whisper that comes to you at night and tells you it would be easier to be dead. So the reason that that stuck out to me is because like when you think of aging as this like matter of fact thing that will just inevitably happen with the passage of time and that it doesn't necessarily have to be associated with sage wisdom and life experience, which like I do still think it is, but I thought that that was an interesting way of thinking of it, is of like we can't assume that someone who's older is going to have more life experience, kind of as what you were saying, Liesel. And to connect this to some real life experience, a friend of mine was recently dating someone a little younger than us. And ultimately, he just wound up being disappointing on a few different occasions. And my, advice or my commentary to my friend was, in a non-patronizing way, this is why we don't date younger people. It's not because they're bad people. They just literally have not had enough life experience to like know how to be a person. And
Mhm.
obviously this is a roles reversed type of situation of dating a guy who's younger. But I think that like this theme of simply living more life does or does not equate to more like life experience or knowledge or wisdom. And I think that there are cases where it is and cases where it isn't. And it's important to keep an eye out for it.
I think that to pull this out of a dating context and what this reminded me of in my own life, which I am not saying that this person does not have more wisdom as a product of their life experience, because they absolutely do. But something I've come to realize in my recent adult life, not that recent, but general adult life, is just that parents, like my mom, don't know everything in the world. And like, I think that's something that has been, first of all, very difficult for me to grapple with. But second of all, just that my entire life, I thought not only did they know everything, but like could do everything. And it's just so crazy to me that after birthing me and raising me, they don't have it all figured out. But again, I mean, that's a little bit different, and that's just pulling it out of a dating context. But that's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, and just how, yeah, like you said, G, like life experience is not directly related to years life lived. And I think that was a really cool part of the book, that she has had all of this experience in her young life.
Lily, just to validate and add to what you're saying, I definitely had the experience a few years ago of realizing like there was something about thinking of it in this way that clicked for me, where I was like, my parents have never been like, both my parents have just recently turned 55. I'm like, they've never been 55 before. Like, the same way that I'm 22 and I've like, this is my first time being 22. This is their first time being 55. And like, this is also all of our first times living in the year of 2021. So it's like we are all experiencing new things and feeling confused and lost and not knowing what to do at times. But also, like, that's not to say that older people don't generally have more comfort or more like, I guess they're not uncomfortable with that sort of, oh, things are kind of unknown, but like I've made it this far, you know?
Yes. Wow, I thought we got so much wisdom already from just the very first theme going. I do think also a quote that I thought was important was that Eric finds his mortality and soft, meaty body a petty, incidental thing. I, on the other hand, am acutely aware of all the ways I might die. And I think like whenever I read books that have race, as a component in it, like I typically find so many quotes where I just find myself checking myself so much and thinking that it's just so important for us as white people to try to like put ourselves in the shoes of people of color and people of different backgrounds, because I really do think like there is such a threat to life that comes with being a person of color, that like we will never know or experience. And so I think it's really important for us to like to point out those quotes and like see those moments where it's like, yeah, I just go through the world like la di da, no care in the world, whereas other people find just walking down the street to be, potentially dangerous.
I agree, Liesel. And I also think like it is sort of cliche to think of it as like, oh, we need to put ourselves in their shoes. And it's like, ultimately, that is what we need to do. But it's a lot harder to do that when we're watching TV or watching movies. When you're reading someone's writing in the first person as your own internal monologue, like you experience it differently. And so I think that getting the opportunity to read in the first person, the perspective of a Black woman is a lot more insightful than, like, let's say, watching a movie or watching a TV show on the same experience.
I agree completely. And Liesl, I like that you said check yourself, because there really is some level of reading that and being like, I know that when I had those moments, I was kind of like, wait, what? And then I had to reread. I mean, in this book, I did a lot of rereading sentences because the flowery language just sometimes went right over my head. But it has different value in being able to tell you a message in a way that if you saw it on a TV screen or in a movie, it wouldn't hold that same weight. And I think that it does boil down to checking yourself exactly.
Yeah. And so now that we're talking about race, I would love to bring up another theme that I personally thought a lot about, which was kind of the element of race and transracial adoptions. So obviously, Eric and Rebecca, this white couple, have adopted this teenage young Black girl. And I thought that there were so many moments in the book about that dynamic that were quite interesting. I really liked the quote where Rebecca was talking to Eric and she said, "We can't let her do whatever she wants just because she's Black. That isn't intersectional feminism. It's bad parenting." And I really feel that, parents of a child of a different race, like there's just so many things that you have to keep in mind. And I think it would be really, really challenging to make sure that you're accounting for all of like the racial complications and things that might come up. Obviously, Akila's hair was also an issue. Akila's tutor was being racist towards her, like right under the noses of the parents, and they just like didn't realize Akilah, you know, has moved to this all white neighborhood and is feeling like she didn't belong. And then, of course, there's the encounter with the police and this kind of idea that Akilah doesn't know the script of how to talk to the police as a young Black girl because she's being raised by white parents. And I thought that was super interesting as well. And so overall, like, I thought that that was one of the stronger points of the book, was to kind of point out some of the issues and pitfalls with transracial adoptions, because I do think there are a lot of people out there who just see it as like the savior, like beautiful, wonderful thing to do. But I think like as a white person, you have to really think about it and really like know how to handle, you know, raising someone of a different race.
You know, I don't mean to take us down a different path related to race, but just something that was coming up for me that I feel is relevant in this conversation. I feel like I was like slightly more tuned in to Edie's interaction with the other Black woman at her original job, and the like conversations that they have, or the conversation that Edie is having with herself, and then also a conversation that winds up happening, like playing out in real life between the two of them, of like, as a Black person in a white dominated space, do you take the attitude of, I'm going to try and appease the white people to the best of my ability so that I can like rise through the ranks saying F you to all these skanks? Or am I going to try and just like stay true to myself and live with the consequences of that? And, you know, I think that that is just a really interesting, like, question to have to ask yourself. And also something that does sort of, in my mind, kind of tie into the interracial adoption discussion. And also, just because this is sort of front of mind for me, the relationship between MLK Jr. and Malcolm X as two like figures of the civil rights movement. One that was very like kumbaya, like, you know, sort of whitewashed in the way that it's taught to us, of like, oh yeah, like we can all get along with peace and love. And Malcolm X as this like more aggressive Black nationalist figure. And so yeah, I don't know, that all of these themes are sort of churning in my head as I'm reading this book, and I felt that I wanted to share that.
Totally. I thought that was a really important part of the book as well. And I think that's a really good point. And I think that a lot of the time as white people, we're exposed to a lot of narratives and stories about, you know, people who are more like her coworker Aria, and people who kind of like just go with the flow and don't like go against the grain. And I think it's really an interesting experience to read this book with this character of Edie, who like is just so like unabashedly like herself. And I think like, you know, is so open and honest and like real about all of her experiences that she's having, you know?
Yeah, I thought the rawness of it was definitely admirable and something I enjoyed. I specifically really liked Edie's relationship with Akilah. I thought that was really interesting to watch that play out. And I think that because there were so many yet so few themes happening at once, I really looked over the adoption situation. I mean, I thought about it and like they mentioned it in the book, so obviously I totally understood what was going on, but I don't think that I gave the interracial adoption the attention that it deserved until hearing you guys talk about it. And I definitely think that it is something that could have been explored more in the book, because it would have benefited from that type of attention, but that the figure that Edie was able to be in Akilah's life was a really cool one. I also really liked learning about Edie's family history as a Black woman and in a Black family, and her relationship with her parents and all of that. I thought was interesting in terms of what you hear about in like with Black stories in America and raising children and things like that. I thought that it solidified some things that I thought I knew. I thought that it questioned some other things, so I enjoyed reading that part as well.
Lily, I agree that in some ways I felt like I was lacking an understanding of how it is, or how it was that Eric and Rebecca even came to the decision to adopt because there's mention of like, oh, I didn't want to be a mother, or oh, like I don't think that Rebecca wanted to do adoption. And so like we get these sort of hints that the whole adoption situation must have been more complicated than we were really getting the full story of. But at the same time, part of me is like, I sort of appreciate that aspect of the story was only hinted at. Like, I don't think that we needed all of that backstory, but I was a little curious about it or wanting more information on that.
Yeah, and I completely agree that I think that there were a lot of themes going on in this book. Like there were a lot of deep topics, and it did feel at times like some of them weren't being addressed as fully and richly as they could have been. And it wasn't a super long book. So it did feel kind of like a lot coming at me, at least personally. But yeah, I did kind of write down work and diversity and career as kind of one of the major themes, I thought, especially with her relationship with Arya at work, who was confining to the expectations, of what everyone else thought she should be like at work. And then I also found this quote interesting, that when Edie went for a job interview, she said, "The expectations of me in these settings are frequently so low, it would be impossible not to surpass them." And I think that that's a really, like, that really was upsetting to me, because I feel like whenever I've been in a job interview situation or thought about a job interview situation, I feel like I need to rise to the occasion, like I feel like it's my time to like really put my best foot forward and like put in a lot of effort. So I've never thought about a job interview situation being the kind of thing where the expectations of me were so low. I always feel like the expectations are high, and I feel like on one hand you might hear that and think like, oh, that's so much easier, that's like a blessing, but it's really not. Like that's such a demoralizing, like harsh reality.
I just also think it's interesting, like somehow, funny enough, like these are themes that I feel like have just been relevant in other topics of conversation or in other areas of my life. And so that's why also things that maybe seem slightly unrelated are coming up for me. But in my mind, it's all totally making sense. Just that, like, the idea that having a job is what gives your life meaning, and that, like, as a reader of this book, you're kind of like, she's literally floating through, like doing nothing. But it's like, why do we have this attachment to the idea that having a job is what gives your life meaning? And like, I will admit, I have that attachment. That is the way that I like see things. And when I'm reading this, I'm like, how does she just have such a like complacency with floating through life? Like, why does she not want to have a job? And even towards the end, she's like, I'm willing to take this job I don't really want because there are some benefits or whatever. And even then I'm like, okay, finally. Because in my mind, I'm like, okay, having this job, even if she doesn't love it, like can allow her some income and some like freedom to then live a life outside of work, because I don't feel like she's living at all right now. And I think maybe part of that has more to do with the fact that I perceive her to be depressed. But like,
I don't think that's just a perception.
But I just think it's interesting that like I found myself reading it and being like, there are multiple agents involved here, myself included, and characters in the book that are passing judgment on this lack of a job as having little meaning to your life.
G, I think it's interesting that you say that, because I think hearing those words just helped the thought that I had percolating form, which is that when I read about her sexual adventures in the workplace, I was so annoyed with my girl Edie. Like, I was like, Edie, stop. Like, this is your job. You are not allowed to sleep with every single person. Like, you're fucking yourself over. And obviously, because I'm reading this from Edie's perspective, I'm forming a relationship with her. So, like, whether I like it or not, I'm rooting for her. I mean, I also think she's like a generally likable person. There was no reason for me not to root for her character. But when I was reading about her sexual endeavors, I was like, okay, girl, like end this. Like, you need this job. This is not gonna end well. You need to stop this. And now hearing you say that, it totally makes sense as to why. And I'm embarrassed to say that I place so much value in having a job. And like, as someone who's currently looking for a job, I think this is a great reminder for myself that like, we don't need to place all our value in that. But like, subconsciously, that was everything to me for her. And like, for her to be living her best life, which like, yes, I understand you need income, but like, there's so much more than that. But I was really boiling it down to like, if she doesn't have a job, nothing can go right for her, which like is so not the case. And that's not what I would say to anyone else. So like, why am I internalizing those feelings for myself or for this character? But I really was. And that's why I was getting so frustrating hearing about Mark or like all those other men where I was just like, stop. Like, I don't want to be reading about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that like that was one of the elements of the book that was most relatable. And obviously when Queen became a dasher, you know, I really started to relate to her, at least personally. And you know, but one thing that I found a little bit unrealistic about the book that I kind of wish there was an element of is like I felt like Edie had literally no one on this planet who was like a close person. You know, she's not close to her parent, or her both of her parents are dead, I
No
think.
friends,
No
no
friends,
friends,
not close with
no.
her roommate, like no one at work. And so she's like, when she's living in New Jersey, like it's literally these people that she like has in the world. And that was just like, I get that for the story, you know, it helps to make her be in a worse place. But it's like no one on this planet like is so alone, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, I do think that is some people's experience, but
Like
it also
no
just,
one
I
to
think that
have no
there are, Liesel, there are without a doubt people that have that experience.
I
But at the same
guess.
time, it just felt a little dramatic.
That's yeah.
It felt a little dramatic.
Like I wish maybe she like had like just a distant friend to like text
Okay,
every once in a while or something.
And listen, maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe things were going over my head, but it felt unrealistic when Rebecca runs into her because of DoorDash and then invites her into the morgue and then says, "You're coming home with me."
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Literally,
absolutely felt unrealistic. You
Yeah.
are not misunderstanding. Do you think that would happen as a dasher? One time we dashed to a hospital. Need I remind you? We dashed to a hospital. I got out of the car. I brought the woman her cake to the hospital. She did not invite me inside. We did not talk. I gave her the cake and we drove away.
But that does bring us to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is Rebecca's job, which I found to be one of the more interesting elements of the book, especially the fact that she was taking Edie along. And I just think like thematically having someone who's, you know, doing autopsies as a character, like what type of person can handle that? And so I kind of wanted to get your girls like reading on why she did that. I do have one quote that I will share, which says, "Of course, this is what Rebecca loves about the work, the stories the bodies tell. She believes the best way to see how a thing is made is to take it apart."
well, okay, hear me out. I didn't understand Rebecca until we learned about this.
Mm-hmm.
And what is that? That's her job. Her job is giving her whole character its entire backbone.
Yeah.
I'd like to point that out.
No, that's actually very, very wise, Gigi.
I just feel like this needed so much more attention than it got. And that is how I feel about most things in this book. This is a great jumping off point. Like her working in I've never met anyone that does this for a living. I've never heard of anyone who does this for a living. Obviously, I know it's a job, but like I know pretty much nothing about it. We did not, in my opinion, get the explorative writing I wanted about how Rebecca came to work in this job. Fine if you're not going to give me the backstory. How she feels about it. I wanted more because I just feel like this was another thing that was like kind of glossed over, but also kind of not. And I'm only now giving it a fraction of the attention I want to because it's being brought up. So thank you for bringing it up. But like, this just feels like a cool theme that like, in my opinion, like you don't work in this line of work for no reason. Like it seems like there is a reason or there's something about you that like makes you this type of person, and I want that info for no reason other than to elevate the relationship that I can develop with Rebecca, therefore elevating how I feel about the book and my reading experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I think then like Rebecca's job then sort of segues into Edie and her artwork, and the fact that she is repeatedly painting, dead people, and I believe her dead mom, who she saw, she painted a couple of times. And then Rebecca kind of brings Edie along to paint the cadavers that she's working with. And I thought that Edie's relationship with art was quite interesting. Like the fact that
Sorry, go ahead.
the fact that she struggles to make a self-portrait, and that she ended up dropping out of art school to do something more practical, but then that sort of like backfired also. And it was something that I kind of wish had been explored more deeply. I know that's kind of what we're saying about a lot of this stuff. One quote that I did really like about her art was that she said, "I am good, but not good enough, which is worse than simply being bad. It is almost." And I thought that that was like a really powerful quote, because I think a lot of people are like good at things like sports or art or, singing, acting, like a lot of the things that people are passionate about, especially when they're young. I think a lot of people end up feeling like, I'm not good enough to like make this a career in my life. So now, like, what do I do with my life? And so I thought that
And
that was an
also
interesting point.
that with art or anything creative, there is this immense pressure to be like the best if you're going to make it a career.
Yeah.
Personally, I found the whole art thing to be cheesy and bad. I did not like it. I just felt like struggling artists, like, I feel like I've been holding back a little bit in terms of just like, because for the most part, we've been talking about more like conceptual stuff that I do have thoughts on. But when we really zoom back in, I'm reminded like, I didn't like Edie. I didn't like how like sassy, moody, nasty she is. And like, I just, again, no one smiled. Like, I don't think anyone smiled. And it's like, I know that it's important to tell these stories. And listen, I think that this is an unpopular opinion. I didn't love the bell jar. But I appreciated it. And I feel a similar way about this book. We're following a depressed young woman as she's stumbling through life, and to be honest, it's an important story. There are things I can learn from it. I read it, I finished it, I've taken things away from it, but I wouldn't use the word enjoyment when describing the experience.
Just to devil's advocate for a minute, I did like her artistry. I thought that it was one of the few things in the book that gave some dimension to the characters. Like, Edie at least was like, she like manifested herself in my head. The other people, I was literally like Eric is in my mind the worst of them all. Like, Rebecca, okay. Akila, okay. Edie, yeah. Eric, like, literally, like, to think of who he is, I can't do it. And so I can appreciate that, like, her artistry fit her and it gave her some life. And I do think it built her character. So I did like that. Enjoying the book, if that's what I'm also commenting on, yeah, no. The day-to-day reading, no, there was not overall enjoyment. I kind of felt similar to about this book that I do to The Bachelor. Like, ugh, I have to read it right now. I have to watch it right now. I'm gonna do it because I a little bit want to, but like, there's no enjoyment during, but like after it's okay, and like at the end it's not bad.
And I think like something that would have added to this book a lot and added to that enjoyment factor, in my opinion, is if Edie had even the littlest like sense of humor. And I'm thinking back to a book that I read called Nothing to See Here, which is a book about a girl in a difficult situation. She has been kind of depressed, but like she's so self-aware and just like joking about everything, and like, not joking about everything, but she adds that little bit of sarcasm and a little bit of like, something going on that just adds a little bit more of a realistic, fun, enjoyable element to the book.
And there definitely are moments where I would be like, ah, ha, ha, because she does have some sarcasm or like quick wit. And honestly, there's even one moment where I was kind of like a little bit laughing that I wish I had made note of so I could relay it to you both now. But I feel like I also just really wanted like some more dialogue. Like,
Mhm.
because dialogue is also a space where you can create humor and there can be
Yeah.
jokes between characters. And like, I also feel like I, of course, get to know characters through the descriptions and situations that we get in a book, but a large part of it is also like how they conduct themselves with others through spoken word. And I really like felt like I lacked that.
Yeah, completely.
Another thing I felt like I lacked, slash, we started it, but like it just didn't happen, is like the sexy time in the book was not working for me. When
I
I
agree.
started this book, as we mentioned, I thought this is about a young Black woman and an older white man who's in an open marriage and their relationship. I got that a little bit at the beginning, and I literally, when like my roommates were asking me what book I'm currently reading, and I told them all about it, and they'd be like, "Oh, Lily, how's your book?" We started calling it my sexy book because I literally thought, by nature of the name, even the cover, like I think I'm getting sexy time. And
Yeah.
typically, when I read sexy time, it's fun to read. It's fun to talk about. Okay, somehow the sexy time in this book was not fun to read. It took away, and that is a place where like I'm not asking Raven Leilani, the author, to like change anything like in terms of what she was writing about, but I just don't think that writing about sex like that was effective.
Yeah, I don't think that the writing about sex was effective, or like maybe the point was to like really just kind of downplay it and like that was the point. I also think like now reflecting on the book, its contents and its name, I almost think Raven Leilani was playing upon people's expectations of a book called Luster about an open marriage with an older man and a younger Black woman, that it was going to be some like 50 Shades of Grey, like, you know, whatever type of sexy novel, and wanted to subvert those expectations by then handing us this instead.
I
And
feel played.
Yeah.
and I will say, okay, so this is a slightly separate note that is still on this topic that I wanted to share. As a young woman, as a sophomore citizen, I feel like I am navigating my way through trying to understand what sex is, what sex means, what gives sex meaning, what gives sex excitement and passion. And when I'm reading this book, I'm like, what what about this relationship was at all sexually stimulating for either party? Like I don't see that, other than the initial shock of the age gap. Like okay, sure, maybe that adds some like intrigue and passion and spark, but then beyond that, it literally was like as if their sexual and non-sexual relationship became so like suffocated and robotic, the way that Eric and Rebecca's marriage was. And but it also didn't have the loving or familiar aspect that theirs did.
Totally. And yeah, I'm thinking back also to that scene where she went and like talked to that guy that she had a sexual relationship with at work, and that whole like encounter and all of that sort of stuff. And I think that like, yeah, in a lot of ways in the sexual realm, I felt like she was quite passive and just like just so whatever about it. And I think that like Raven Leilani was trying to make it gritty and realistic, but it ended up just kind of falling a little bit flat.
I agree, Liesel. I think it wound up falling a little bit flat. And this is part of what I'm getting at of like, yes, people do have this instinctual desire to just have sex, like from a biological standpoint, but there is motivation. Like we feel called towards people or attracted towards situations for a reason. And I don't think that it's more realistic or more gritty to just make it more like primal. I
Yes.
I think that maybe the attempt was to make it more primal and more gritty, more realistic, but like I that doesn't feel more realistic to me. As a fellow 20 something, I'm like, I'm trying to think about all the reasons why I would want to have sex, who I would want to have sex with, like thinking about my motivation and where the attraction is coming from, not just like this primal, gritty, realistic stuff.
Yeah. And I think like, Edie at the end of the day, like just didn't feel like a 20 something that I would know. She felt like a little bit of a 35-year-old in a 23-year-old body. But we still like her, we still enjoy her. We hope for the best for her. Okay, the last major theme that I wanted to talk about, which was actually my favorite title of a theme, so I'll read that aloud. It was Misfits, Outcasts, Comic Con, and Loneliness. So I actually thought that having Akila be into anime, video games, Comic Con, like was so Gen Z and like actually very accurate of like what a young girl might be into. But I thought that at the same time, Comic Con, nerdy stuff, like all of that kind of stuff is very thematic and is emblematic of how Akila feels, that she's a little bit of an outcast, a little bit of a different type of person, and that she might relate to that sort of like nerdy, outcasty stuff because of her situation.
Yeah, Liesel, I agree that it does feel realistic, almost to the point where I'm a little bit like, it's this close to being cliche that the 13-year-old girl is like into fan fiction. Um, but I do agree, Liesel. I do also love the title of Misfits, Outcasts, Comic-Con, and Loneliness. I think that you really did sweep up a lot of what's going on there. And I think that by grouping all of those things together, it gives it a lot more meaning.
Yeah, I honestly don't even think I've given it the attention it deserves. Like, I definitely liked the Comic Con aspect of it, and I liked that she was interested in that. I thought the Comic Con scene was interesting with the drugs and all of that, and Eric having his moment. Um, but I didn't even think about it in terms, which I feel like I keep saying this, like, oh, I didn't even think about that because there were just so many themes that I couldn't dive in. And like now that I'm saying this, how could I not think about the misfit of it all? But I didn't even put two and two together, which maybe is a criticism of the book that I feel like I was robbed of the opportunity to even put together Akila's interest in anime and all of that at all relating to her feeling like an outcast and whatever else. But I did like that, and I thought that it made her relatable. I mean, I think the whole book was meant to be this like kind of doing nothing. It is relatable by nature.
I really do feel like all four of the characters who are living together are all misfits in their own way. I really feel like they're very disjointed and they don't like eat dinner together. They like don't really do that many activities as a little squad. And what I
None of
really
them are friends. None of
no,
them are
well,
friends.
like you could argue that Akila and Edie are friends.
Only really at the end. And like, I feel like they really had to overcome the hurdle of feeling like, oh, we're supposed to be friends, so
Right.
we're not going to be friends.
Yeah.
And then they find their way towards each other in their own misfit way.
Yeah. And it's like everyone was kind of operating in pairs, if anything, like if ever with someone else.
At any
Um,
given moment, but they could always be switching.
yeah. So what I wanted for Edie, I feel like, and for all of the characters, to be honest, was just like for them to have like a family and like be a nice little family or something at the end. Like I kind of just wanted, Edie to like just be the nanny and like move in and just like have one big happy family.
Okay, so Liesel, I also agree that they did operate in pairs, and I felt like at any given moment, and okay, maybe this doesn't really include Akila, but like of the three, they were always paired off, and the third was the enemy. I believe that at any moment where Rebecca and Edie were like pairing off, they were both thinking of Eric as the enemy. And when Rebecca and Eric would team up, it was Edie is the enemy. And then when Edie and Eric would match up, Rebecca was the enemy. And so I think that also kind of fits into this outcast theme as well. This is just one other comment that I need to make in terms of like realistic versus unrealistic stuff. You're telling me that Eric comes home from a business trip, sees Edie, in his home after not having any like contact. And then Rebecca and Eric have some night-long conversation therapy session. And then no other dialogue occurs between anyone else about what the fuck is going on. Like, how are so many things in this book happening without conversation? The amount of uncertainty that riddles this situation is through the roof. And the fact that no one is seeking uncertainty reduction is unhuman.
I completely agree. And I think that, that is the perfect note for us to give our final thoughts. And then we can do our Hollywood treatment of who we would cast in a movie version of Luster. I will say overall, I think that this was an interesting book. I'm glad we read it. As we're saying, like, it wasn't what I wanted it to be. And maybe that was intentional from Raven. Like, Raven was, entrapping me, as Gigi's saying. I thought it was going to be this like 50 Shades of Grey with like, an element of race and like, all of this interesting, stuff going on. But it was really a harsh look, into one girl's experience of the world that I think was in some ways eye-opening and did bring up some interesting topics and themes. If I was going to give this book, a star rating out of 5, I think I would give it a solid 3. I think that there was some value there. It was not a completely horrible read. It was very nice to read overall, and I think it did bring up some interesting things. But I think that the plot, the source material, all of these characters that were developed could have been mixed together, and like these 4 main characters like could have been a much more interesting book, in my opinion.
I will agree, Liesel. I'll give this book a 3 out of 5. There were definitely redeeming qualities. I think that the skeleton of it is interesting. Our characters are interesting, but I think a few tweaks could have been made to the execution. I do think it was well written. Like, there are so many powerful statements, sentences, phrases, word choice, all great. But I think because it was relatively easy to get lost or like read a paragraph and not feel like you gleaned anything from it, and the fact that the enjoyment of actually like sitting down and reading the book in its entirety was not that high, that is why I will land at a 3 out of 5.
I give it either a 2 or a 2.5. I give it a 2.25. And I feel like that just comes down to my enjoyment while reading it, which was pretty low. But overall, I can respect the conversation it sparks. I do agree it was well written. And like you both have said, it has redeeming qualities, but I just wanted more and less at the same time. And I did not particularly love the act of reading it.
Okay, so I think that overall, we would recommend this book if you are looking for that kind of experience of really getting into someone's head, thinking deeply about some themes, but definitely wouldn't recommend if you're looking for just something fun, light to read.
And I also think you have to know yourself and know the kind of reader you are. If plotless or plotful matters to you, this is plotless. So if you need plot, run away from this book. If you can sit with plotless, then absolutely give this one a go.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so now for my favorite part, we are going to say who we would cast in a movie retelling of Luster. Would I recommend Luster to be a movie? Probably not. Definitely heavily reliant on the first person narrative structure, which would just be completely lost in a movie. So, but just for funsies, we will cast it. So my Edie, which, as we had discussed previously, like, there is definitely a lack of women of color options within Hollywood. So don't make fun of me for my choice, but I chose Zendaya. Lily, is that who you
did too?
Okay, good.
I will say I do think Zendaya is a pretty good fit, considering she is no stranger to playing this kind of like misfit bumbling along, depressed type character. So to be fair, despite the shortage of women of color in the Hollywood rotation, I do think she's a legitimately like reasonable cast.
Yeah, and I think that I do think that Edie and Rue from Euphoria are similar characters. I don't really like either of them particularly, so.
And I also think that Zendaya, despite being like, 23, 24, or I guess not despite, but, she feels like she's a young person. Like it wouldn't be one of those casts where they cast like a 30-year-old as a college student, It would feel like she is bringing Edie to the correct age, which would be, I think, an advantage of the Hollywood treatment.
Okay, Gigi, who's your Edie?
I didn't have an Edie because of the fact that I couldn't brainstorm someone who I felt was actually a good cast, but I agree with Zendaya. Zendaya crossed my mind, but I wasn't sure. But now that we've talked it out, I feel strongly that that's a decent cast.
I also will say that my backup Edie was not backup, but another person that crossed my mind was Keke Palmer. But I did kind of feel like I was just casting her because she like is a young woman of color. Like Zendaya spoke to me.
She also is like
Palmer's
she
there.
is like 30. Like Keke Palmer is a little old, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, next up for Eric, I'm so proud of my casting for this. Well,
sorry. I've come up with a couple other Edies just now.
Okay.
Yara Shahidi could be one.
Yeah.
And the girl who was in Amandla Stenberg.
Okay, actually, Gigi, I had considered both of those people as well, but they feel a little too young to me still.
Sure.
That's what I think. So for Eric, I have Jaime Lannister, who is also in the film The Other Woman. And he's like the, bad.
What's
like
the actor's actual name?
I think his name is Nikolai Coster-Waldau, something like that.
Yeah, that is it.
And especially his acting in The Other Woman, like he's just really like good at acting like this awful guy who everyone hates. And he's just like this, it's very typical white suburban looking man to me. So I really feel like he would do a good job with Eric.
I again had two. Mine is mostly Casey Affleck. But James Franco was in and out of my mind at moments. They both just feel like oldish men that like could be attractive but aren't like overwhelmingly attractive.
I think James Franco is a little too attractive and he's a little too bad boy in my opinion.
Okay, fair. So Casey Affleck is my main one. He also like Eric had dark features in my head, and so the Casey Affleck dark.
So my cast for Eric from the moment that I opened this book, I was seeing Bennett from Bachelorette as Eric. Like fully 100%, that is who I was seeing.
That's really funny.
And like through and through, that's generally who I was seeing. Right age range, right vibe, right just like weird, but like also not a real person vibe.
Totally.
That's a good one.
Okay, for Rebecca, I'm once again very proud of my casting for this. I chose Serena Joy from Handmaid's Tale. Like, I literally think that woman would kill it as Rebecca. She could like be with the dead bodies. She's very like serious, but then she has her moments where she's nice.
Liesel, I chose a very similar cast. I chose Rosamund Pike.
So similar. Yeah, that was good, Gigi.
For all the same reasons, all the same vibes, but like two
housewife, but also like, has her own thing going on.
Also creepy and dark.
Really? I chose Brie Larson.
That's interesting. She's a little young, I feel.
The face was in my head.
No, I get that. I get that.
So yeah.
Cool. Okay, for Akilah, I chose Sky Jackson. I know that she's like 20 or something, but I feel like she still looks 13, and I feel like she would be able to bring the depth, of emotion to the role of Akilah.
Sky Jackson, by the way, is 18. So she's
not, like, 18.
Totally out of the realm.
Yeah. I love that you know her exact age off.
I pulled it up.
Oh, okay. Who did you say, Gigi?
I didn't have one because I don't know.
Lily?
I chose Lyric Ross, who plays Deja in This Is Us.
Because
that's who she was. Like, that was the only character through the whole book. Like, I knew it was her in my head, everything.
That's really good, Lily. Okay, well, that concludes our book club episode. As a recommendation, since this is a book club episode, I will recommend a book I read recently called The Midnight Library. It deals with the multiverse and all of the different outcomes that your life can end up having, which I think was super interesting. Would highly recommend it. And with that, we will say thank you for listening to Sophomore Citizens, the podcast by young people for young people, with new episodes pretty much every Monday. So we will see you wise babies then. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, email us at sophomorecitizens@gmail.com, and be sure to leave a 5-star review.